I made this series of 12 live videos over the 2022-23 holiday season. I think it's a good series, but the YouTube algorithm kind of buried it. So I've re-edited the videos and I'm re-releasing them onto my main channel over the coming weeks in the hope that more people will find them. Let me know if you're finding them useful and if you have questions. Hello, and welcome to day 7 of the 12 days of Celtic mythology. So please say hi in the chat if you're watching. So over the 12 days, we're working our way through a story called The Adventures of Art, Son of Conn. And each day I tell a bit of the story, and then I use it as a springboard for exploring kind of dark and mysterious corners of Celtic mythology. If that's making the story difficult for you to follow, there are links to where you can read the whole story or hear me telling it in a oneer, and those are in the description below the video. Now, this is where I usually start telling the story, but there's a bit of a loose end from yesterday, so I'm going to start with that. Yesterday, I talked about magical cows, and I love cows, and magical cows are just regular cows, and how they're often sovereignty figures in Celtic stories. So if you haven't seen yesterday's episode, day 6, you might want to go back and have a look so that this makes a bit more sense. If you remember, I said that the cow in yesterday's installment of our story had always felt odd or out of place to me. It doesn't seem to be doing what cows usually do in these stories. So some of my students and patrons are watching these sessions from a Zoom call, and we have a discussion after the live stream every day. And yesterday we had a good chat about the cow in this story. Well, we kicked it around. We didn't literally kick a cow, but we kicked this question around. And I have some pretty smart students and they had a lot of good ideas. So ultimately we came up with this that I'm going to tell you. So I hope I can state it so it makes some kind of sense. In other stories, a cow is usually magical and deeply related to the abundance of the land. And it's even a kind of stand-in for sovereignty figures, which is a role often taken by a goddess or perhaps a fairy woman. But the cow in art seems to lack that. She shows up, led by an otherworldly woman, at the moment when the men of Ireland are about to make a blood sacrifice of this woman's son. So the cow gets sacrificed in place of the boy. But the whole thing is basically a waste of time. In fact, the story would function perfectly well without this entire cow and woman subplot. So the cow's a bit of a non sequitur, and that's part of what's always bothered me. One thing that happens when we analyze myths is that we may decide that the story became garbled somewhere along the way on its way to us. And then we might form theories about how an earlier version might have made more sense. And that's what I'm about to do. And while I think I might be right, it is just a theory. So feel free to quote me on my theory, but don't tell everybody, well, Chris Hughes says this story really goes like that. If you cast your mind back to the story of the fairy cow from yesterday, it's at the point where the farmer is about to slaughter it, that the fairy owner of the cow appears and reclaims it. So this is exactly what happens when they're about to slaughter the boy Shegda in our story. His mother appears and leads him away, but she's also leading a cow. And then the cow is sacrificed. In fact, she suggests it, which, if the cow was a sovereignty figure, is very strange. And if you would sacrifice a cow that was a sovereignty figure, you would expect there to be a huge disaster to come to the kingdom, which doesn't happen. The closest analogy I can think of for that would be when Evnissyan slaughters the Irish horses in the second branch of the Mabinogi, and the whole rest of the second branch is like a Greek tragedy. But what if the original story didn't have the boy and the human sacrifice in it at all? Well, what if maybe the Druids simply sent Conn in search of the cow, or he had possession of one of these magical, bounteous cows for some reason, magical cows. Maybe with the intention of slaughtering it, or maybe just with the idea that its milk would feed the people of Ireland, like the Glasgowan does in folk tales. And then there was probably something about the slaughter of the cow and the fairy woman coming to take it away in an earlier version of this story. So I think maybe that might be closer to how the story originally went. It's quite possible that by the 15th century, the storyteller wouldn't have seen the sovereignty aspect of the cow clearly. So if the story was kind of in that shape, and he maybe didn't remember it really well, he might be trying to come up with a plot that makes sense for something that he doesn't fully understand. I suspect that the tellers of many of these folk tales about fairy brides and fairy cows had lost track of the sovereignty aspect and simply thought of them as cautionary tales, not to be greedy, not to mess with things that belong to the good folk. It's still a bit of an extra plot line. As I said, the story would function without it, but I think this makes a lot more sense than precisely what happens in the story. So let's just remind ourselves now about where we are in the story. Con, the king, has married a woman called Bécuma, who was in love with Con's son Art. When Con met and married her, however, she told him that her name was Delbchaem, the daughter of Morgan. By now, Con knows her real name, Bécuma. All the prophecies that he's been getting from his druids and from this fairy woman have confirmed this. She's come from the other world. She's kind of bad news. And they all agree that the famine in Ireland is because he's married her. However, he stubbornly refuses to give her up, and the blood sacrifice hasn't helped. So let's go on a little with the story. So Con he couldn't bring himself to let go of Bécuma. The sight of her beauty cheered him, and the presence in his bed of this young woman made him feel young again. Art and Bécuma, meanwhile, became mortal enemies, united by their ties to Con and their hatred of one another. One day, Art was playing at fidchell with one of the druids, and Bécuma looked on. When the game was over, she suddenly spoke to Art. "A gesh on you, Art, son of Con, if you will not give me a game for stakes." So Art agreed. They played, and Art won the game. "I demand the wand of Cú Roi Daire as my forfeit," said Art. And he thought that such a thing was probably impossible to get. And that way, the search would keep Bécuma away from the court for a very long time. Well, Bécuma set out to seek the wand in the she-mounds, but everywhere she was refused admittance until she came to the place where her foster sister Anya was. Anya said that they would find the wand in the stronghold of Cú Roi on Slievennish, and so they did. Bécuma returned to Tara, accompanied by Anya, who was under a cloak of invisibility. Bécuma handed the wand to the astonished Art and demanded a rematch. Well, they began to play, but the unseen hand of Anya was on Art's gaming pieces. It caused them to make false moves. Everyone could see that somehow Art was being cheated, but no one could show any proof. "A gesh on you, Art," cried Bécuma when the game was hers. "On my honor," replied Art. "Tell me what I must do." "You will eat no food in Ireland until you find Delbchaem, the daughter of Morgan the magician." "Tell me where to look for her," said Art. "I will only tell you this," said Bécuma. "She is in one of the islands of the sea." So, did you catch that? This is where the story takes on a weird new layer. So let's get this straight. When Bécuma arrives in Ireland, she's in love with Art. And she tells Con that her name is Delbchaem, daughter of Morgan the magician. And I'll just remind you that this is not Morgan Le Fay. Morgan is Delbchaem's father. So Bécuma has told Con that her name is Delbchaem. Now she's sending Art off to look for Delbchaem. So there's something really odd going on here, which is one reason I love this story so much. I wonder what's going on. You'll have to keep tuning in to find out. Oh, and also you may have wondered what's going on when it said they were playing fidchell. So it's a kind of board game, probably a bit like chess. So you might also have noticed the word gesh being used in this part of the story. And if you want to know more about gesha, then I talked about those in day 5 quite a bit. So go back and watch that one. The other thing that jumps out at me here is the mention of the wand of Cú Roi mac Daire. So Cú Roi is known as something of a magical character, perhaps a bit of a magician, certainly having strong supernatural powers. So the first thing that comes to mind when you hear wand is a magician's wand, and it could mean that. However, R.I. Best's translation, the only English translation that there is of this story, puts the Irish text this way. So in rather old-fashioned English, because it's 1905, he says, "And gesh on thee," said he, this is Art speaking, "if thou eat food in Ireland until thou procure the warrior's wand, which Cú Roi, son of Daire, had in his hand, when taking possession of Ireland and the great world, and fetch it to me here." So I haven't actually been able to find a reference anywhere to either this wand or to Cú Roi being king of all Ireland. So that's curious. But in the context it's used, it might be a wand of office, like something a king holds to show that he's king, a piece of regalia. So Cú Roi is a king of Munster, and Art has some connection to Munster in some other stories, and his sister is married to a king of Munster, Olive. So Cú Roi is a really interesting character. We know from story lists that there used to be a lot of stories about him. We still have a few. And this high promontory fort in Kerry is said to have been his fortress. And it's the setting of the story of his death, which I'll come back to. In the Ulster cycle, Cú Roi is famous for hurling great stones in battle, and predictably there's at least one boulder field in the landscape, which is attributed to his actions. And that could possibly suggest that he was once considered a deity, maybe. He certainly has magical abilities. In the story Bécum's Feast, he challenges 3 young warriors to a beheading game. One of those warriors is Cuchulainn. And you might know about beheading games from the story of Gawain and the Green Knight. So this is usually instigated by a being with magical powers who invites mortal warriors to strike off his head in return for him being allowed to try to strike off their head. Now this seems really illogical, right? But of course, when Cú Roi's head, or the Green Knight's head in the story of Gawain, and the Green Knight is struck off, the Green Knight, Cú Roi, doesn't die. He just picks up his head and carries on. He gets the head back on, and then it's his turn to strike the warrior. And the point of this is generally that it's a test of bravery. The warrior doesn't lose his head in the end. In Bécum's Feast, Cú Roi finds Cuchulainn to be the bravest of the 3 warriors he challenges. However, later, Cú Roi and Cuchulainn become mortal enemies over a woman called Blathnat. In the end, Blathnat, who's married to Cú Roi, ultimately betrays him and sets things up so that Cuchulainn has the opportunity to murder him. And the story is a bit too involved to go into in the time we have, but it's very similar and has a lot of interesting parallels to the story of Llay and Blodeuwedd in the 4th branch of the Mabinogi. I've put a couple of links in the live chat to where you can find stories, read the story of Cú Roi and Blathnat and Cuchulainn. So that story of Llé and Blodeuwedd is quite famous also, the woman who turns into an owl. So I'm going to leave things here for today. The story from now on actually will start to be much more about Art and his adventure. I know it's taken us a while to get to that part, but that's just how the story is structured. I haven't expanded the boring bit or anything. I hope to see you tomorrow then, and I'll be continuing the story, and we'll be talking about voyages to the other world.